argument much more eloquently.
Oh,
So welcome.
Can't imagine so. Thanks, Ilda. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I think we have a lot of reciprocal and shared interests. So Ilda's work populates reading lists in my department, and we enjoy to think with her insights on informality and governance in cities in Africa. And I'm very much looking forward to ongoing conversation also tomorrow with some of the student presentations. So it's great to be able to come here on such an occasion when you can have an interaction. So thank you very much. Okay, what I'm going to talk about will resonate very well with Kevin's discussion of comparativism and his example of doing comparison through following policies. And what I'm going to do is step back a little bit and try and press away at what exactly is at the core of a comparative imagination. So what exactly are we trying to do when we're comparing? So Kevin set out very nicely for us some of the limits of earlier comparisons. Trying to compare whole cities, tending to compare like with like, having very reductionist criteria for comparability, always designing it with the older theories in mind. So how do you ever open yourself up to ideas that are completely different or from quite dissimilar places? So lots of limitations. So that's what the 2011 article, Cities in a World of Cities, set out. The limitations of comparison for doing a more global urban studies. But at the same time, there's something very seductive. There's a lot of potential in the idea of comparison. So we push it to its minimal form. What is that? And that's where I've been thinking this term, thinking cities with elsewhere. The cities is maybe a troubling signifier there, given current debates, but I want to persist with it for various reasons. I'm happy to talk about that. But the point would be, how do we think about the world that is presenting itself to us in one particular place with elsewhere, with experiences of other places, with connections to other places, with theories and ideas that come from somewhere else? And in a sense, that's what the comparative moment does for us, if we take it to its minimalist form. And what I'm interested in doing, what I've been trying to work on the last few years, and I sent to Ilda a couple of papers which are trying to set that out, and you're very welcome to get them off her. I've been trying to think, how can we reimagine comparison for our purposes? So rather than having this quasi-scientific, very old-fashioned, limiting view of comparison, how can we reimagine that potential to think with elsewhere for now, for specifically an urban problematic? So for thinking the urban, what would that comparison for thinking the urban be? And for a post-structuralist time, a time when we don't go following variables and dependency and causality in some strange scientific way. And for a more global urban studies, for an ability to think the urban from anywhere, starting from anywhere. And it's not as easy as you'd imagine to try and provoke that assemblage of ideas which would recast comparison for us. So this has been very compelling time for me. I'm very pleased. It feels a bit at an end, and I'm now heading on to more empirical things. So I think you'll have a bit of relief from all the philosophy that informs trying to reimagine comparison, and we'll look at some provisional examples of how we could put a reformatted, a reformulated imagination of comparison to work. Now, Jamie Peck has recently written a quite provocative paper, which, like a few different interventions at the moment, reviews the state of urban studies, thinks about the different contributions, and thinks about where urban studies might be going. And in this landscape, he places comparative urbanism quite favorably. In fact, he's very positive. So he says the comparative imagination has constructively opened the horizon for a different kind of urban studies. And by that, I think it's very much the post-colonialized, more global approach to thinking the urban. But what he's very critical of is that there's a lot of posturing, and he says at one stage some I can't remember the phrase he uses, but you feel like some lonely voice in the wilderness calling for comparison again and again. But what he suggests is that there's a need for more round trips, he puts it, between positional analysis, that is, we must think from the global south, we must post-colonialize, and more actual theoretical insight, actual thinking, actual conceptual payoff is what he's looking for. And I certainly agree with him, because I think that's the point, to change the concepts, to think again, to think differently, create concepts that are useful for the many different kinds of cities that we're interested in, or we live in, or are committed to thinking through. So this is what I think is the burden of reconfiguring comparison, to do that conceptual work, to give us the potential for new insights. So we don't all have to think like Jamie Peck all the time. We have the option to come up with some new idea. So that's the point. I also think he's a little bit ungenerous, because in fact I think if you look across the work that's been done in the name of post-colonial urban studies or comparativism, we have many rich conceptual insights. They may not conform to what he would like, and you'll see later a quote from Neil Brenner which suggests that while we might confront this complexity of the world, we should really do so within a geopolitical economy perspective to be really insightful. So in a sense we're allowed to stretch our wings but not to escape from the authorized narrative. I'm suggesting that we should have a possibility to have a completely revisable form of theorization, something which is open to critique from anywhere. And what that also, as a corollary, implies is a different culture of theorizing. So it requires an openness, a willingness to listen, willingness to change your mind, a willingness not to see yourself as the authoritative center of knowledge, but to be able to be respectful in your encounters and engagements with ideas. So this is what we require. The reason will be very familiar to you, which is that, in fact, if we want to think the urban in any grand theoretical sense that people often like to do, the urban is increasingly produced in Asia and Africa, considerably less in Europe and the USA. South America has been substantially urbanized for some decades. So we have an enormous imperative to embrace the cutting edge of urbanization in the globe, not only in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the productivity of imagining and designing the future of the city. Something much more than just numbers going on. And that I think the dynamic places, the places where urbanization is happening very rapidly, are also, through the kinds of processes Kevin is talking about, reshaping the format of the urban in many other places. And that perhaps is one of the limitations of trying to think in a regionalist way about reconfiguring urban theory. So if we take an internalist Asia point of view, we miss the way in which Asia is now setting those agendas for other places, and how is that happening? So this is one of the questions, it's a bit small for here, I'm sorry. One of the responses to this problematic, how do we reconfigure the field of urban theory for a more global imagination? One response is to do that in the name of some various territorializations, kind of lumpy gatherings of different kinds of cities. So can we do that in the name of the global south? We might ask. And this is often one of the strong critical voices, the new subjects of theorization, as Ananya Roy puts it, can claim an authorization in the name of this entity, some geopolitical imagination of the global south. Now, what does that do? I think it holds some dangers for us, partly because it potentially resets us to a situation where we have quite differentiated urban experiences and where people can dismiss theorization because it applies only to that part of the world. So it's possible then we can see emerging in the literature, people say, well, I'm just talking about cities of the north, let them off the hook, to bother to think with the insights of other places. And also the global south is a very baggy category. We don't know where it is, what holds it together, what is the consistent feature. I think it has a great productivity as a rhetorical, strategic reply to a theory which has hegemonized itself from a certain location, which is often wealthier than northern cities. But that's also shifting. And what I suggest we might do is go to the reasons why we want to mobilize this rather baggy geopolitical category. which wants to catch places from, Beijing to Buenos Aires and Benin and so on. So why would we hold all those cities together? And the reason the Comaroffs in their interesting and provocative book, Theory from the South, suggest is that we want to have a voice of eccentricity outside the dominant analysis to speak something else. And I think that's a very important motivation. But whether we speak something else in the name of the Global South, which we could do for an instant, but then we have to unpack that and say, well, exactly where, exactly what's the specific argument you're making, what context are you thinking about? It disappears very quickly. But that point of eccentricity, I think, is an important energizing force. And the second is a concern with inequality. So the Global South emerges as a geopolitical category concerned to scoop together poor countries, countries in the third world outside of the dominant first, second world political alignment. So this is it's a strong critical voice, a voice for justice and concern with inequality anywhere, hence the Global South. We could find it in London or New York, perhaps. So it goes. I think this is also very important, but we should name it as it is, and its geography is very complicated. Certainly the Comaroffs are very quick to get into all the caveats and exceptions. The north and south are very connected up, all sorts of labyrinthine capillaries, blah, blah, blah. It's very messy, in which case we need to get down to think of what those geographies are and to think with them and talk about them. So I think really what I have long argued is that we should try and compose differentiations and categorizations and ways of thinking that help us with the problem to hand. They don't set some big geopolitical category which potentially divides cities and lets us not think the urban across the range of urban experiences in the world. And people like Malik Simon, Stefan Lanz, a recent work in a book called Global Prayers, which is a fascinating collection, ask us to really press away at placing all cities within a single analytical field, and then thinking in more complex, perhaps differentiated ways about how we come to understand that urban. We also have real dangers of the Global South being hegemonized by certain urban experiences, especially the growing potential for hegemonization and scholarship around Asia, which possibly re-marginalizes African experiences, which, if you think about inequality and critique injustice, deserves a lot more attention. The other kind of initiative we have seems to be evacuating that difference in some way and asking us to theorize from some universal position which is perhaps a bit preordained. So we have this rise of an interest in planetary urbanization building on Henri Lefebvre's work, asking us to question the idea of the city as a territorial entity and rather think about the production of the urban which is going on at a planetary scale, through some of these widespread connections that Kevin is talking about, but which is also a more subtle theoretical argument, not simply about the geographical stretching of the production of the urban, but about the fact that the urban experience, following Lefebvre, is coming to define social life. So rather than having an industrial society where the characters and sites and processes of industrialization shape social life, the fabric of cities, the way in which cities are produced economically and socially and politically comes to define the social world at a planetary scale. So a worldwide, that is the whole of the social world, as opposed to a world encompassing across the whole planet. So this is quite a complex argument. And the thing that I would suggest is that even if we wish to transform our theorization this way, to attend to the urban in this particular theoretical and spatial analysis, we will still find a highly differentiated urban. Things are going to be different all over the world. The processes, the extended urbanization processes that Brenner and Schmidt talk about will be differentiated, different in one place than another, and so on. We will still require to think this different geographical imagination of the urban with, I propose, a comparative imagination to think across its differentiated production. And just as one example of that, if we're concerned about, for example, the way in which what Neil Brenner calls the operational landscapes of urbanization, where you think about the pylons stretching across the landscape, the water pipes going from remote rural dams into the city and so on. This is the operational landscape enabling the urban to exist. This is going to be very different in different places. And I was struck by an example from the Global Press book talking about the expressway strip from Lagos to Ibadan in Nigeria, which is a strip of development occupied by prayer camps, huge mass religious spaces, many of them. So here we have a sort of extension of the urban environment, but it's rather different from perhaps the Las Vegas strip, which the writers in this book pick up as a comparative insight. So we need to think differently about the different processes and outcomes associated with planetary urbanization. We might also find ourselves drawn to a more area studies perspective, and here we have the two examples which I think are important to bear in mind as we imagine recrafting urban studies. The one, thinking through African cities, which have been theorized and imagined often as an exception, or even in some views not very urban in their urbanity. And we take somebody like Garth Myers, who writes a book called African Cities, and in fact what he's interested in doing is showing how the differentiated experiences of urbanization in Africa can speak to a wider analysis. So a sense of wanting to launch a story into a wider conversation, not to segment it off within the territory of Africa. Africa is very connected up, of course, to everywhere else. And here the imagination of Malik Simone is terribly important, because not only does he try to create stories and analyses of cities and their distinctiveness to innovate and generate concepts, which we'll discuss in a minute, but also to stretch those stories from one place to another in a similar way to Kevin's discussion earlier. So we're following the connections that people make. So Malik says in one of his early papers, Worlding African Cities, says if you want to know where African cities are going, you need to follow the people. So partly it's a sense of people as infrastructure, follow the people, they're making the city, but also they're moving off beyond the city to other places. And if we follow those connections from Dakar to Jakarta, as he puts it, we start to imagine the urban through bringing quite different contexts into proximity, thinking about the different ways in which people, often the same people, are making these different cities in his analysis. So on the one hand, we're working with specificity and distinctiveness. On the other hand, I think within some of this writing on African cities, there's a very strong interest in worlding the theorizations, and I take that as a great inspiration. We also see in Roy and Ong's book, Worlding Cities, which Kevin also referred to, this sense of trying to think with the prolific circulation of ideas and practices. And what they take as their reference point is quite interesting, which is especially Ong, I think, and we need to pay attention to the different tones of these two authors and their work. In fact, so Ong takes a stronger view of a kind of inter-Asian, but within the horizon of Asia, production of a specific form of urbanization, a specific form of global aspiration, as she puts it. And Roy asks us to treat that with some strategic disdain, in a sense, so that she talks about the making and unmaking of the referent Asia. Who's producing this idea of Asia? How is it being put to work, and how is it being undone, perhaps by more prolific circulations or the interpenetration of quite different regional experiences? So it's impossible to think of these interreferencing practices as ignoring the West, which Ong tries to suggest without essential reference to the West. In fact, I find it astonishing that she would say that. I don't know how you can imagine how it is that Chinese cities are being produced without a reference to multiple consultants and investors and various attempts to borrow, copy, often refuse or imagine from completely first principles some particular outcome, but I wouldn't think that's very helpful. So we see here the possibility we could stretch to a sort of area studies separateness, really, with analysis. And I think we want to guard against that edge of the regional studies enthusiasms. But as somebody who has worked a lot within Southern African regional studies, it's a terribly rich thing to work within a regional tradition of scholarship, of thinking from a place. So I wouldn't want to argue against that. But I would want to argue with two of my favorite South African, well, Mbembe is more West African, but writers who live in Joburg now, that we need to think cities with attending to their embeddedness in multiple elsewheres, prolific overlapping interconnections, framing all cities. And this is just a little sample from my own hanging out in downtown Joburg. Here we have some Pakistani traders selling belts downtown where it says no trading allowed, and they're right next to the Metropolitan Chief of Police, so that's a great comment on governance. Some of the lovely skyscrapers framing Joburg's history and imagination of itself. It's very international. In the 1930s, just like Chicago, and then following a range of international modernist styles, attempts to launch itself as a white modernist success story with this tall tower in Hillbrow, which is recycled as a post-apartheid imagination of Joburg's global ambitions, which is quite ironic. And then scholar Tanya Zak in Little Addis in downtown Joburg, which is an area of town which is intensely occupied by traders and people who orchestrate the retail space, recycling office buildings for intense retail occupations. So people from all over Africa trading in small little shops in high-rise buildings. So you have like a really informalized skyscraper experience across several blocks of the cities. Completely intense experience. So we have in just this one city and one bit of it, multiple elsewhere shaping that city. So to my mind, what I'm looking for is a kind of imagination about building concepts from anywhere, but to contribute to stories, to an ability to theorize and think which can match the spatiality of cities themselves as highly connected up but differentiated and distinctive in terms of outcomes. And what I thought after some engagements with the comparative method, so one of the problems within urban studies is with how we imagine a case. So if we're thinking about difference, and if we have in the back of our mind this very complex spatiality of the city, multiple overlapping, interconnected, rapidly circulating shared ideas, but often quite distinctive outcomes in terms of at a neighborhood scale, perhaps in terms of wider urban regions, perhaps in terms of regions, and so on. So we have both specificity and things that connect cities and ask us to think them together. In this case, if we want to open up our conceptualization of cities, I think we need to examine what we've thought of a case as being for. So I think very often when people have approached the kind of top-down comparisons that Kevin was critical of, I'm not sure I would, well, yes, I mean, I think that's a fair description. I mean, it's a new term to me. I'm trying to think about would I work with that or not. I mean, it's a bit different from how I would call these things. But as a top-down comparison, we compose a case. And why do we select, what do we think the case is for? What do we think the particular outcome is for? And quite often in the conventional comparative imaginations that we've inherited, a case is a particular outcome. But it's a particular outcome defined in relationship to a wider process or a universal phenomenon that we already have some theoretical knowledge of. We've already specified what it is. And I think in philosophical terms, a particular is a particular instance of a wider universal process. It is pre-specified. So this often gets worked out in urban analysis through having a certain wider process or universal phenomenon kind of hitting the ground somewhere and becoming hybridized and mixed up with a whole range of different local things. So that's how some sort of specific outcome emerges, because it's hybridized. But we already have in mind what this is a particular case of. And how comparison often works is that we'll think then with the complexity. So that's very promising. So I invite you to hold on to that for a minute, because that's an extremely promising way to go, that we would try and link up cases through some shared phenomenon and then think with the immense variety. And in fact, that invites us to stretch the variety further than has happened before. But one of the problems with starting with a pre-given concept and then looking at how it is hybridized differently in different places is we don't necessarily allow the empirical detail to come back and transform that initial process, to displace it, disturb it, to send it on its way. So it's not very helpful. Or let's think this with some other sort of lens. So there's been very much a sort of control of the possibility for thinking otherwise, for thinking outside of the pre-given specificity. And what I have tried to do in a paper that Ilda can pass on to if you like is to explore within two philosophical idioms the possibility of recomposing the case, recasting it. So in the one hand in a Marxist idiom, because I think a lot of the very strong authoritative literature within urban studies at the moment is done within a political economy and Marxist idiom. And I feel it's very important to open up a conversation about exactly how it is that specificity and theorization relate to one another within that idiom. And then on the other hand, I've been extremely inspired, partly following some of Jane Jacobs' work, which Kevin was also talking about, to explore Gilles Deleuze's analysis of difference in repetition. So this is a philosophical analysis trying to understand how it is that we can think across repeated outcomes that are differentiated in each instance. He also has a much wider philosophical project. So what Jane and myself and others are interested in exploring within his work is a small way into a very big philosophical project, which is to try and recast Kant's theorization of how we come to know the world. So there's a big project. We'll see a little bit how they map onto one another. So I start then with this question: what is the status of a case? What does a case mean? If we go to some particular outcome and we want to think with it, what can we do with it? Do we find it as one slightly varied example of something we know very well, like neoliberalism now in some hybrid form or other? That's what Chowdhury, a nice article from 2012, suggests is a defanged empiricism. That is, the empirical detail doesn't actually have the purchase to damage the concepts that are coming the way. We're still stuck with neoliberalism. So if we say the cases, for example, my favorite way to think about it is the concrete totality. And this is to pick up mostly from one of Lefebvre's very early books, called Dialectical Materialism, in which he is thinking with Marx about how we understand understand the nature of social and economic processes. I'm just going to jump forward to this so we can see about that. So concrete abstractions is the more familiar way in which we think about Marxist theory. So this is not that complicated if you just hold on for 1 minute. And the point is that in much of Marx's work that we inherit, we find so exciting his formulation of things like money or labor power, or in Lefebvre's work, property, which are concrete abstractions. They are ways in which the concrete processes take one bit of an object, a phenomenon, and make that the defining feature of it, the thing that is operative and works. So money is an abstraction that comes into being in a practical way. It's a practical abstraction which we need. It links two things together, and it doesn't deal very well with the fullness of those things that are being translated with money. Or property, for example, takes the richness of a place and defines it by what it's worth, its value, its financialization, and so on, its territorialization in a certain way. So these are abstractions. They're abstract from the fullness of life, which are developed in practice, in history, in the processes that are shaping things. Now, I'll just ignore the lateral totalities. That's a step too far for a short talk. So Marx suggests, though, another line of thinking about the relationship between the abstract and the concrete. Instead of thinking about these concrete phenomena that are already abstractions historically, he wants us to think about the concrete as the fullness of itself, the fullness of what we see, of what we find. And he suggests that we come to know the concrete in its fullness, the totality of a concrete situation, as a synthesis of several determinations. So many, many things we have to bring in if we want to understand the fullness of the situation. We have many, many concepts or relationships need to be understood to account for the fullness of a particular situation. And Lefebvre works very much with this because he's one who's a big fan of the richness of human experience or the fullness of place. This is his touchstone philosophically and politically. So he picks up this concrete totality from Marx's Grundrisse, Introduction to, and he works with it very much, and he suggests that the concrete totality, multiple, partial, open, infinitely complex and interesting, inépuisable, inexhaustible, characterized by a tangle of relationships. And I think this resonates very well with what is really within contemporary critical geography, a very conventional view of place. So if we take Doreen Massey's global sense of place, a thoroughly non-essentialist conjunctural analysis is how John Pickles puts it. The fullness of everything coming together, tumbling together, always exceeding our attempts to catch it. And this is a dilemma within Marxist theory for a long, long time, since, over this century and a half of thinking with Marx, this problem of what we do with the complexity and the fullness of a social experience. So if we, rather than going with the idea of concrete abstractions or abstractions in practice, we rather think with the concrete in thought, the concrete that we have to try and understand in all its fullness and inexhaustibility. This is a challenge for Marxist theory too. And on that basis, every theorization, every conceptualization you bring to that concrete requires reinterrogation, might be in question, need to be changed. In that sense, theoretically open as well, which Lefebvre was very strong on. Now, on the other side, if we think with a Deleuzian hat on, we might treat the case as a singularity. Rather than a pre-given case of something that's already been theorized and we approach it with a concept, it is just what it is. It's one particular outcome amongst many, many different outcomes. It stands principally as itself, which doesn't mean that our conceptualization of it stands as itself. So this is the rather dismissive tone that Scott and Stauper adopt in their review of urban theory, where they suggest, well, what are we proposing then? One theory per case. Ha, ha, ha. How foolish is that? No. But the point is, every case is itself, irreducibly. So, but how do we go about generating conceptualizations that are shared and travel, theories which might work across different cases? How do we work with that case that we treat philosophically as a singularity, as only itself? It does not mean that we are simply theorizing one concept per case. And what I'm going to talk about now is how we would work with that now less conventional philosophical framework of Deleuze to perhaps create an imagination of different kinds of comparative tactics. What does it mean? How do we come comparatively to cases that are concrete totalities, full and rich and complicated, always more than we can abbreviate, which is Lefebvre's term, or as singularities that stand initially for themselves? And I think this is quite an important debate. I would encourage us to try and think with the perplexities of political economy and the post-structuralist initiatives which are prominent in critical geography. And this slide signposts a debate between Brenner and his colleagues David Madden and David Waxmuth and Colin McFarlane promoting an assemblage thinking. And I think we could find some common ground. So Brenner et al. Suggest, for example, that assemblage thinking opens up the prospect for thinking space as a relationally overdetermined plenitude, which is effectively a concrete totality. It's the same exact words from Lefebvre and Marx. But he suggests this needs to be linked to critical geopolitical economy to be effective. So that's to kind of try and tie it back to a familiar and very generative theoretical framework. But I would suggest that we need to be willing to also exceed that through attention to concrete totalities and singularities. So we could talk about that a bit more. So one place to start with seeing what does this mean to treat cases as singularities means that for Jane, she's suggesting that we need to work with multiples. So we start off, we have many different cities, many different outcomes. And we don't treat them as, she calls it addition. So one more case city in a project of building general theory, so we know the broader conceptualization, we get the specific outcome, and we try and sort of keep that story going, but as things that subtract from conceptualization, that mark the difference, that work with the fact that the concept cannot encompass the richness and fullness and specificity of that outcome. That we work with this to undermine, to subtract from cases. And her basis for this is thinking with the dilemmas of repetition and difference, so picking up from Deleuze, and she looks at how when you make many repeated instances, each one is different. Each one in different contexts requires different assemblages of allies, she calls it, in different settings, using a kind of actor network theory approach. So her example are residential high-rises, and these are pictures from Glasgow's Red Road, which is one of her case studies. The other case study is Singapore. And what's interesting about this is instead of starting off from a pre-given conceptualization of some kind of global process hitting the ground and producing in each case an example of itself in an international modernist high-rise, she takes this more actor network theory perspective to look at the genesis of each instance. How is each residential high-rise put together? Through what specific mundane, quite material processes, through what processes of imagination, policy importation, political contextualization, and so on. All these processes are put together to produce one specific high-rise, which is a repetition in some ways, but in itself distinctive, different. We could say a singularity. It is its own production. And she suggests, as we look across all these different outcomes, these different residential high-rises, what we're looking at is the production of a global effect. We see the production of some idea that we might have a globalized phenomenon. It's not in itself that some globalized process is hitting the ground. So it's to take a different point of view, a genetic point of view, to think about what are the shared processes that are producing this outcome, this one. So she has the example of residential high-rises, but cities are full of things like this that are repeated. I mean, pavements, roofs, tree planting on the sides of roads, gated communities, magnificent buildings that make a political statement. We have things that are repeated in many cities, not just because somehow they emerge out of the ether, but because there are practical physical interconnections, whether they are circulation of materials, ideas, whether they're circulation of plans or policies. All sorts of processes create a network of interconnected processes which generate different elements of the urban. So if we want to think then about across the urban field in a Deleuzian frame, we could be talking about, if we would find some resonances with his idea of virtuality. That is, there would be some set of possible urban outcomes available within all the circulating interconnected things that make up the urban across the globe. And at any particular outcome could be generated out of those interconnections. And Malik Simone talks about this in the sense of producing any city whatever. The possibility of elements of urbanity being produced. So that might be one way to use Deleuze's virtuality. And I just compare that image for you briefly with what I consider to be one of the very best examples of comparative urbanism in the traditional idiom that Kevin talked about. So here, Susan Clark in 1995 studies 8 American cities, very carefully selected to be comparable, same size, experiencing similar processes of restructuring, fiscal crisis, delinking from investment from the state, and so on. So she does a very strong job of getting cities that can be compared within a very traditional idiom. But then what she does, is taking this restructuring and looking at how it appears differently in different cases, is she produces a theorization less based on the process, which remains an intact conceptual landscape. You know, we have restructuring, it's affected America, it's about fiscal decline. We just note in passing that it's not about massive manufacturing expansion, where that moment of restructuring was for many cities, massive expansion, industrialization across China, Asia, and so on. But in her case, restructuring means purely fiscal rollback, fiscal crisis for states, searching for new ways of managing and governing, which links again into Kevin's story about financialization of development as one option. So what she does then is she thinks with a variety, which is fascinating. So the thing, that's not the process that remains intact, but she's inventing concepts around the different ways in which cities respond through democratic state-directed forms of intervention to solve crisis-related problems, or market-driven, off-the-books, informal alliances with business kind of solutions. So she thinks of that variety. So for me, I think that we can potentially bring together this kind of genetic imagination of Deleuze, asking us to think with the prolific interconnections which produce any number of different, repeated but different outcomes in cities. And we could also look to think across the variety, the differentiation of outcomes across cities, which is in fact what vernacular comparative methods did. So that's one of the other things that I've done, is to try and go through what comparativists were actually doing. Does the big statements about proper method, do they really matter to what people were really doing? And it seems to me what people have been doing, and we see Cantor and Savage, who are some of the most prominent comparativists at the moment, saying this very precisely. They selected their 12 cities, whatever, across various American and European contexts, because they have variation in outcomes, in governance outcomes across these cities. So what we want to do is to think creatively with the many different versions of governance, or of responses to crisis, or of housing policy, or urban strategic visioning, whatever. We want to think creatively with a variety and generate insights from that. And that, I think, is where I would be interested in rehabilitating the top-down comparative point of view, I think, and reconfiguring it. That is that in a Deleuzian idiom again, the world presents itself to us, comes at us, and in his language it presents itself as problems or questions, and we trying to work out what's going on. And I think it's often lost within, especially geography and urban studies, reception of Deleuze, that was his project, to work out how do we come to know what's out there? How do we generate some understanding or response to the world? So in that process, we, as very fractured, sometimes chaotic or insecure or fragile subjects, we're not necessarily coherent, we don't know the whole world, we can't piece everything together, but we can come to know some things. We try to generate our own concepts. How do we understand the world? And how we do that, he also uses idioms of difference to understand that. So in terms of the genetic processes that are producing cities, the analogies that he uses to talk about the different, repeated different outcomes that he's interested in thinking with are things like genes themselves. So we think you have a certain pool of genes which generates any number of individuals, each of us, quite specific, but we are produced out of this virtual genetic pool, perhaps. Or if you think about a mathematical equation, you might have an equation which describes a line of many, many different points, all equal possibilities within that virtuality. So we could think genetically then about the production of many, many different interconnected but singular outcomes. On the other hand, as we approach the world, how do we generate our concepts, thinking across all these differences? How do we come to know something? We come to know not on a blank slate, but because we have ideas about many other places. We have concepts to think with. We have an inherited world of conversation and interaction. And we will work across the difference. We will work with the concepts we have. We'll try and put together a story about what is there. So we can also find in his and Guattari's commitment to a generating concepts approach to philosophy and knowing the world, inspiration for holding on to but reconfiguring how we go about thinking across the variety of different outcomes. So I would want to hold on to two genres of comparison then. The one which is very resonant with Kevin's discussion earlier, how we trace interconnections amongst cities and in some ways look genetically for the causes of urban outcomes, different in many different forms and contexts. But on the other hand, I think we could also have generative comparisons where we try to compose conceptual alignments across different outcomes to think about what is there, how do we understand it? Could we draw inspiration from this case or that case? And in that moment, we radically need to reconfigure the rules of comparison, which is where the images of concrete totalities or singularities are so important. What is this case? How can we place it alongside other cases? So as we come to produce concepts about phenomena, and concepts move around, we try and use them in different places, in the sort of imagination that Deleuze is talking about, and also just in our own observations of things, the concepts fit more or less well to different places. Some kind of difference between one case and another, the variety draws away from the concept. It takes away from it subtracts from the value and utility of that concept. So we could be left with concepts without difference, concepts that parade around the world, thinking they can explain everything. I could mention some examples, but you can put your own in there. They may be imagined to remain inviolate, to remain the same across many different instances. And this is one particular direction of problem in theoretical comparativism. But equally, we would have much difference which has not yet been conceptualized. And I think this is where we need to be generous in our engagements with a new wave of theoretical production. That is, if you're working in contexts which fit not so well with concepts, which require new conceptualizations, which might be fragile, which might be initially exploratory or provocative, we need to be willing to hear those and listen to them and not say people have not been successful at theorizing yet. So at the end of the day, what I'm talking about is trying to recraft comparison, taking it back to its very minimalist definition, thinking cities through elsewhere, to try and understand the outcomes we see around us. And the strategies we can use to do that include composing analytical constellations or proximities across different kinds of urban outcomes. And this would be a remaking of a traditional comparative endeavor, a vernacular comparative practice within urban studies. This would be generative. It would be something that is there, eager to try and find new ways to think things. And I use the phrase topological there in the sense of John Allen's work, which talks not about topographies, which are physical connections, but imaginative connections, various kinds of realignments of space, which bring different contexts together in the interest of conceptual experimentation. Or we could trace connections, and we had a wonderful example of that. Look at the repeated outcomes, to build natural comparative experiments, to look at high-rise housing in this place and this place. They're interconnected. They give us some grounds for thinking with the variety that we find. And I think here's something that we still have to think much harder about, is exactly what comparative and conceptual work does it do to trace connections? Exactly how does it help us to understand the urban better? This would be genetic in the sense of being produced out of the wild proliferation of interconnections that make the urban. It would be more topographical in the sense of tracing actual connections and links amongst cities. And we could, I think, very importantly attend to questions of singularity and specificity and the fact that existing conceptualizations leave many places unthought through in certain idioms and registers, and allow for the launching of concepts into wider conversations from specific places. But I would guard against trying to segment those off and territorialize them. The point being to generate concepts and enable conversations beyond the single case. Now I've quite lost track of time, Ilda. How are we doing?
You could start rounding up if you...
Okay. So I had like a whole other talk on the examples. Sorry. Partly because I think of the way the two talks went together, we didn't really get there. So I have different ways of setting these out, tracing, composing, launching, genetic or generative, and different kinds of examples of the kinds of comparisons that, comparative tactics that might come into view. And these are, people are very busily doing all these. So I have the paper version has got lots of examples of this. So the three core things in the middle here are composing, tracing, launching, being the three that I've identified. And we could be designing bespoke projects, composing comparisons by looking across repeated instances, doing unexpected comparisons. And we have a wonderful one from Ananya Roy when she comes home from Calcutta to San Francisco and starts to think about things differently. Or recently, Garth Myers in the Singapore Journal of Tropical Geography does the same sort of thing. We could trace connections, circulating practices, drawing different places together through these empirical links, or we could compare connections, as we have from Ola Soderström's wonderful Cities and Relations book comparing Hanoi and Ouagadougou and their insertion into the world. We certainly want to keep in view this generating concepts in specific contexts to use more widely. And at the various ends, we have a very light touch referencing to different contexts, which happens all the time, the comparative gesture, or we have detailed cases which we place in relationship to wider theoretical implications. And then one of my colleagues at UCL always calls me out on the fact that surely everything is not always interpretable across different contexts. There are mistranslations, disjunctures. And Tariq Jazeel is very interested in that limits of translation. And he has a recent paper in the Singapore Journal of Tropical Geography too. Now, I'll end just with this provocation, and I could give you a whole lot of examples coming up, but one of the outcomes of this would be to really turn around something of the geography of theorization that we've been used to. So here, seeing from the South point of view, would ask us to look back at places like London, not to assert a global South is different and stop there, but to work with concepts from other places to interpret perhaps anew, or to maybe shed some interesting light on processes in cities which have seen themselves as autonomous generators of theorization for everywhere else. So here could we place London, and here's my homemade photo of bits of London, alongside Shenzhen, Dubai, Kuala Lumpur. How does London get seen from other places? And this is the kind of project that I'm busy thinking about now. And one starting point for me, I was very interested looking at the London Docklands literature on the London Docklands development, which made this iconic new bit of London through the 1980s and 90s. A whole new, huge city, quite striking. So this is a large bit of central London. And the London Docklands development, iconic development of that time, really reproduced a whole new city. And one of the things that is not often talked about is the potential of links, interpretive and practical links, between the Docklands and other so-called mega-urban projects, which can be found all across the world. And an interesting starting point here would be some reading of Chris Old's book, which traces links between Vancouver and Shanghai mega-urban projects in the 1980s and 90s. And along the way, the London Docklands figures in this story as a place where consultants have worked on all those projects together, where different innovations in governance and practice and land, capturing land value and so on, have been learned from these various cases around the world. So in some ways, we could take the analysis of the Docklands out of a very UK-centric story about neoliberalisation, privatisation, Thatcherism and so on, and puts it into another lineage around developmental states and a concentration of political power and a different articulation of the relationship between states and development in cities. So this was a very centrally led initiative. It wasn't, it relied a lot on the liberalization of, the freeing of value from land through private development, but it had masses of money invested by the central government. The land was excerpted from local government authority and placed within the purview of the central state. And there's some very direct links from the experiences of managing a classic developmental state in Hong Kong and the planning imagination that informed this project. So we could start to come to London with a very different imagination if we want to think it through other contexts instead of thinking it in splendid isolation within its own context. And what I want to do with this is much more than simply trace the connections, but actually think with the differentiated experiences of governance of mega urban projects around the world. And perhaps I can just finish with the provocation that some of us are working on, me and Fu Long Wu and colleague in Johannesburg, Phil Harrison, to try and look at 3 large urban development projects and think about how they're reconfiguring governance relationships in different places. And one suggestion, cheeky suggestion might be that very often in the UK and London, these sort of large-scale projects are seen as a kind of post-political outcome at the moment. They're places that take away from the local government's capacity to govern. They're places that involve themselves in a very controlling form of consultation and development, and so on. And we could think perhaps from Shanghai, which is interestingly interested to learn about democratic processes in a place like London, and which has in its own structuring of urban development increasingly needed to engage with mobilized communities in trying to experiment with processes of public engagement in some way, concerned about developmental outcomes. So it's not such a stereotyped relationship as you might think. So if we want to come to the different experiences of governing similarly complex large-scale projects, multi-jurisdictional projects, we have much to think with. And if we turn to the South African case, we have there a phenomenal outpouring of the kind of informality of governance that we learn from many African contexts. Huge mobilization of different community groups, complicated lines of engagement between state officials and community and residents. And if we look, for example, with this lens of informality back to a place like London, we start to see that not only do we find some strange resonances of informality at the heart of development, at the heart of planning. So recently I heard the planning inspector say, this legislation's been abolished in the recent changes in planning legislation in the UK, but I don't have any other guidance, so I'm going to use this 20-year-old guidance to guide what I'm doing. So we find instances, if we look at them with the eye of informality from a context like Johannesburg, we would find instances of that in London. But I would say that even more than that, if we think about informality as a lens in which to think about as emergent forms of associational interaction, unpredictable and experimental alignments between actors, behind the scenes, uncoordinated, unregulated, perhaps arrangements and negotiations, I would suggest that at the heart of the development process that shapes London are precisely those kinds of informal links between developers, planners, politicians, and so on, and that hidden behind a veil of commercial secrecy and some sense of necessary profit to be earned to make a project viable is a deeply informalized development system. So these are hunches, really, that we could think productively with places like Shanghai, like Johannesburg, bring those thinkings back to London and be inspired. Not to say that that's necessarily the point of life, because not everyone wants to think about London, and it could be there are much more important things to think about than to say we must now bring theory from everywhere in the world to think London. but that this is as much a possibility as any way around, that there's generativity in thinking across different contexts. Okay, I'll leave it there, and sorry for going on for so long. Thanks.